Sagittarius tarot reading today. Rumors swirl about you from these individuals. There comes a time when the whispers around you grow louder than reason. Stories told in corners you've never stood in. Assumptions made about a life they've never lived. You hear nothing directly, yet you feel everything. A name passed between lips, not out of reverence but insecurity. Yours. And yet you haven't lost your light. You haven't changed your pace. You haven't dimmed just to make others comfortable. Because some of us weren't made to explain, we were made to illuminate. Lately you may have sensed something strange. The tension before a truth rises. The ache of being seen in the wrong way. The frustration of knowing there are words about you floating through the air that have nothing to do with who you really are. It's not paranoia. It's intuition. And you're not wrong for feeling it. But here's what they don't understand. Your silence isn't surrender. It's self-trust. They talk. They assume. They repeat old versions of you like they own your story. But you've grown so far from that image, you wouldn't even recognize the person they're describing. You've moved quietly but powerfully. You've healed in places no one will ever see. And while they've been retelling rumors, you've been rewriting your soul. This isn't a story about gossip. It's about freedom. The kind of freedom that comes when you realize no one can take from you what they never gave you in the first place. If this message finds you at the right moment, welcome. I'm Sophia, and this is Zodiac Wisdom, a space where astrology meets healing, and truth is spoken not to impress, but to awaken. Like, share, or subscribe if this resonates. Not for validation, but to anchor this moment as real. Let's begin. Gate 1. The mirror of rumors. Not all voices are loud. Some take the shape of smiles that don't quite reach the eyes. Some come as compliments wrapped in quiet comparison. And some arrive in the form of rumors. Lately, there's been a current you've felt moving around you. Not through direct conflict, but through subtle distortions. People talking about you in rooms you've never entered. Your name spoken with familiarity, but never with understanding. They don't really know you. They only know the version they created to make themselves feel safer. And yet, you felt it. You may not have the details, but your soul registers the shift. An old friend suddenly distant. A strange tension in a shared space. A message not sent but sensed. Here's what they don't realize. They're not threatened by what you do. They're threatened by what you are. You walk into a room and things stir. Not because you're trying to impress, but because your presence challenges what isn't rooted in truth. You don't fight for attention. You don't need the spotlight. But your authenticity has its own gravity. And that, more than anything, unsettles those who've built themselves around performance. Some will admire you openly. Some will pretend not to notice. And some will try to rewrite your story with fragments and shadows, because the whole of you is too confronting. What's happening now isn't about your mistakes. It's about your growth. People talk when they feel you slipping beyond their grasp. They fill the space you leave behind with assumptions, just to stay connected to something they didn't have the courage to understand. But you're not who they say you are. You're who you've chosen to become. And that version, stronger, softer, silent when needed, is not reactive. It doesn't need to clear the air. It doesn't chase down rumors to defend its name. It simply walks in its own truth, letting the light do what it always does, reveal. Let them talk. Let them twist. Let them wonder how someone like you stays peaceful in the middle of it all. The answer isn't arrogance. It's clarity. You no longer need to convince anyone of your worth. You've already returned to it. So, if you felt yourself pulling back, choosing fewer words, releasing the need to be understood, trust that. That's not isolation. That's inner alignment. Because sometimes the most sacred thing you can do is not respond. Not because you're weak, but because you've already outgrown the version of yourself that needed to be believed. Gate 2. The familiar voice of betrayal. Not all wounds are loud. Some arrive in silence, carried on the back of someone who once swore they'd never hurt you. And the hardest part isn't the pain they caused. It's how familiar they once felt. There's something particularly disorienting about being misrepresented by someone who once knew you intimately. When a person who held your story close now rewrites it with missing pages and misplaced blame, you can't help but feel the ache of betrayal more deeply. Because they weren't just anyone. They were once a safe place. Or so you thought. And now their voice carries your name like a footnote. An afterthought. A character in a story they're telling to make sense of their own unfinished healing. You may hear whispers, echoes of your name being spoken as if you were a chapter they needed to survive. As if your presence in their life was a detour, a mistake, a lesson, not a love, not a truth, not the sanctuary you once offered. But here's the truth you're beginning to see. They're not lying to destroy you. They're lying to survive themselves. Because when you walked away, you didn't collapse. You didn't retaliate. You didn't prove them right by becoming bitter. You simply disappeared into your healing. And that silence, that calm, centered withdrawal, left them with no control. You outgrew the role they needed you to play. No longer the overly forgiving one. No longer the one who stays even when unseen. No longer the version of yourself that kept reaching back out of loyalty, not alignment. And that scares them. Because when you stop explaining, when you stop softening your truth to protect someone else's comfort, they lose the grip they thought they'd always have. And instead of facing that grief honestly, they wrap it in fiction. A version of you that's easier to release than the real one they were never ready to meet fully. They may never admit it. They may never apologize. But you don't need their apology to be free. You are not who they describe. You are who you've become. And the more they try to speak of you as a closed chapter, the more obvious it becomes they never really turned the page. Let that be enough. Let the pain of their words dissolve into clarity. That your silence was not absence, it was evolution. You didn't vanish. You returned to yourself. You stopped showing up in the spaces where your truth had to be softened to survive. You've moved on, not in anger, not in pride, but in peace. And peace, once chosen, doesn't beg to be understood. Gate 3, the unshakable light. Not all harm comes wrapped in malice. Sometimes it hides behind admiration, the compliments that feel slightly off, the support that arrives only when you're quiet enough not to shine too much. You've felt it, haven't you? Someone listening a little too closely, not to understand but to replicate. Someone echoing your words, your ideas, your energy, only to retell them as if they came from somewhere else, as if they belonged to them. And when that doesn't work, when the world still sees you as the original, they begin to shift. The admiration fades. The tone changes. The sideways comments begin. They're just a little too much. They make everything about themselves. It's not that deep, but it was always deep. You were never pretending. What they tried to copy was not just a style, it was a soul. And here's what they didn't understand. True light can't be imitated, because real light isn't crafted. It's cultivated through silence, through shadow, through the sacred act of continuing to rise when no one is watching. You didn't just speak beautiful truths. You lived them. You didn't just post wise words. You earned them. They saw the calm, not the storms you walked through. They saw the grace, not the grief you transmuted. They saw the confidence, not the years you spent rebuilding your self-trust from the ground up. So when they try to shrink you, to rewrite your depth into performance, your clarity into attention-seeking, your presence into something explainable, it's not personal. It's projection, because your light reminds them of a version of themselves they haven't yet stepped into. And sometimes the soul remembers what the ego can't stand to see, that you are living proof of what they haven't yet dared to become. But here's the truth that sets you free. You don't need to defend yourself. You don't need to post louder, explain clearer, or act smaller. You don't need to abandon your light just because it makes others squint. Keep being you. Keep creating. Keep speaking. Keep living with the same quiet integrity that made your presence powerful in the first place. Because those who are meant to see you, really see you, won't be intimidated. They'll be inspired. And those who twist your truth into something they can manage, let them. It's not your burden to carry. You are not here to be liked by everyone. You're here to be aligned with yourself. So when the room goes quiet after you speak, or when you feel the tension from those who pretend to support you, take a breath. And remember, their discomfort is not your problem. Their envy is not your fault. And their imitation is not your identity. What's sacred cannot be stolen. Conclusion: the return to sovereignty. You've walked through the noise, through the echo of rumors, the sting of misrepresentation, the discomfort of false praise. And yet here you are, not hardened, not bitter, but clearer, quieter, more whole. This isn't about proving anything anymore. You've seen what happens when others try to write your story for you. You've felt what it's like to be misunderstood, misquoted, even imitated. But none of that has touched the truth you carry, because who you are was never built for surface-level approval. You weren't made to be easy to categorize or convenient to admire. You were made to awaken, to walk into a room and shift something unspoken, to speak not for attention but for alignment, to shine not because you're trying but because you've stopped dimming. And now your journey turns inward, not as a retreat but as a return, back to the self that never needed permission to exist, back to the voice inside that doesn't waver, even when others try to speak over it, back to the light that was never loud, but always unmistakable. You don't need validation to know you've grown. You don't need an apology to feel closure. You don't need the world to understand in order to walk in peace. You're no longer in the business of correcting other people's versions of you. You're in the practice of living your truth, deeply, quietly, completely. So if something within you feels softer now, steadier, if you're breathing differently, like you finally exhaled a weight you didn't realize you were carrying, then maybe this isn't just a reading. Maybe it's a recognition. Like, share, or subscribe, only if it feels like part of your return. Not because you need to be seen, but because you're no longer afraid to be. You've reclaimed yourself. Fully. Finally. And no rumor, no imitation, no past version can touch that.